I'm recording. Okay. So let me get this out of the way. Portal, Canvas, 343, modules, and I'll go over the new stuff. Okay, so we are ready to start checkboxes, which are an awful lot like radio buttons, except that they differ in that how many the user can select. So they, in terms of HTML, they have mostly the same attributes, but the way you interact with them can be different, is usually different because of there being multiple answers. So in radio buttons, there's at most one answer. In checkboxes, there's anything from 0 to all the answers may be chosen. So those are the examples that I'm sort of, I don't know, scheduled to go over, and then that lab will be due next week. Are there any questions? I have had a couple of people asking me questions, and it is a confusing thing. There are times when you want something on a new line where you use \n, and there are times when you want something on a new line and you use an HTML break tag. And sort of takes some getting used to figure out which to use when. So if you are usually in HTML, like if you're in something that has an open and a closed tag, if you're in a div, if you're in a span, if you're in a table of a cell, those things that have open and close, and then you typically work with the inner HTML property of those elements, then you are typically writing HTML in there, and you work with the inner HTML property, and you get onto a new line by using a break. So if it has an open and a close, typically we're going to work with inner HTML, and we're going to get things on a new line by adding a break. There's a fancy thing you can do with a pre-tag. There's a pre-tag that will respect your new line things, but that's usually more of a design thing than a code thing. But that's another weird possibility. The one weird, and you work, a related issue is, when do I say .value and when do I say .inner HTML? So things like inputs typically have value. So like a text input, you'll typically work with value. In a div or a span or a table cell, TD, you're often working with inner HTML. Whereas with if you're going to enter something into a text input, then you'll typically work with value. And value goes along with like \n typically. So if I'm working with value, I tend to work with \n. If I'm working with inner HTML, I tend to work with a break. And there are things that you should be working with the inner HTML. And if you say value, it won't come up as an error and it won't show up in the console, but nothing will happen to your page either. So it's just a matter of gaining some experience of, oh, that is an inner HTML thing, and that's a value thing, and sort of value goes with \n. The thing that breaks the rule, usually if you have an open tag and a closed tag, you typically work with inner HTML, and you typically work then with breaks. The thing that breaks the rule is the text area. I've had more luck. I've done better with dot value when working. The text area has an open and a close, but I've had more luck working with it, working with value and \n than with the inner HTML. So that sort of breaks my rule. Usually I say if it has an open and a close, then I'm going to work with inner HTML. The text area is the thing that breaks my rule. So sorry, but till I come up with a better rule, that's my rule, but there's one exception. Okay, so that answered like maybe 3 people's question, because I've had people having that issue, and that's sort of a standard issue, especially if you're new to HTML and JavaScript. Any other questions that have been coming up on as people are trying to finish the labs? So what was due today was homework 2 and lab 2. So that first week we only met once, and then now last week we had a full week, and so now it's like 2 labs and a homework a week. So there were 2 things due today, homework 2 and lab 2. Today I am assigning homework 3 officially. They're there ahead of time sometimes, and I don't care if you work ahead. And the checkbox is the new thing. And then we'll move on. Then we will have covered not all of, but a lot of interfacing, and we will move on to our next topic of objects and classes and so on. Okay, checkboxes. So this is going to be a lot like the radio buttons. So it's like 90% the same. And then you just have to pay attention to what's different. I am recording good, sorry. Okay, so here are I'm in downloads. Let me open up my code, Visual Studio Code. I'm going to open the folder of downloads. And then I'm going to bring in the checkboxes. If I open the folder, it's going to allow me to use my live server. And as I've said before, live server is a bit of an overkill for now, but once we're going to do objects, and I'm going to get objects in the beginning just from data that's embedded in my file, but then I'm going to start reading some separate file. And that's when I'm really going to need the live server so that I can read a data file. Okay, so my checkbox example is about movies. And I want to give, I usually write code for a group of radio buttons and assume that you know how to handle one checkbox. I usually give you a group of checkboxes and figure you know how to write the code for one checkbox. But then I found out that was wrong, that people write the code for one checkbox like there's an array of one checkbox, because they're just following me sort of a little too blindly. Excuse me. So I do in this example have a single checkbox that you must agree to the conditions. Okay, so I pick some movies that I've seen. Schindler's List I've seen, Casablanca, Gone with the Wind, Citizen Kane, The Wizard of Oz. That's what I've seen. And like the radio buttons, if it's checked, I have a styling based on being next to the thing that is checked. I'm going to hit my button. It's going to say that I must agree to the conditions. That's my one-off checkbox. I'm going to this time check that box. And then it gives me a list of my movies. It puts them on the page, and it probably throws them in the console as well. And there's one error here about, this is about when it's downloading, it's looking for this fave icon thing. And if I refresh, it goes away. So what have I seen? Raging Bull, no, I have not seen. I haven't seen The Shawshank Redemption or Titanic. I don't think I've seen all One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now there are movies I have not seen. Okay. So let's look at this code. Okay, I separated a style sheet. The style sheet's going to be mostly the same, except I chose green instead of whatever color I was using when I was doing radio buttons. But it's mostly the same. There's the body, div and input. There's an input of the checkboxes are inputs, and so is the button. Again, there's a way to choose a different kind of button, but if I want to separate the button from the inputs of the checkbox type, I can use this type styling. And if I hover over the button, I do something different. If I hover over the button style changes. That's this. The label is what's next to the checkboxes. I make them inline block. Inline means they can be on the same line as the checkbox. Block means I can give them a width. So they don't vary in size depending on how long the movie title is. They all have the same size. That's what giving them block allows them to have a width, and then the width allows them to have a set size rather than just be as long as they need to be. And here is the styling of the label next to the checkbox. So I have, if the input is of the checkbox type and it's checked, and I'm styling the label that's next to it, its next sibling, then I change the styling to indicate in a style way who's selected and who's not selected. Okay, so that's the style. Here's an input of the checkbox type. Let me collapse that a little bit. Okay, so we're seeing the same attributes as the radio button for the most part. There is an ID. The ID works in conjunction with the label. So the input has an ID and the label has 4, and if they match, then that makes them a team. And if I click on the label or I click on the checkbox, I have the same effect. So clicking on the label Schindler's List and checking on the checkbox of Schindler's List does the same thing. Okay, so that's what the ID was for. The name is for the purpose of grouping, just as it was in checkboxes. So these checkboxes with the movie titles all work with as a set, and I've accomplished that by giving them the same name attribute. And it's a weird name as far as JavaScript is concerned, because I have square brackets in the name. But if you were, in addition to working client side, which is what we're doing, and doing JavaScript, if we wanted to also do some server side stuff like PHP, then the name is also used. For us as JavaScript coders, the purpose of a name is to sort of group things. But the purpose of a name for a server-side scripter is to say, what are you going to pass over to the server? And so in a checkbox, because you can choose more than one, you announce to PHP, for instance, that what you're going to send is not a single movie, but a set of movies by giving it the square brackets and the name. So that's got nothing to do with JavaScript. It just happens that I used to teach PHP. And so that's just setting us up for if you were to ever add server-side code to this page. So it would have its JavaScript purpose of grouping them together, but it would also announce to the server side that what you're sending up is also an array of things. Okay. It's the type checkbox. The value is what you pass behind the scenes, but what's between open label and closed label is what the user sees. In this case, they happen to be the same. They don't have to be the same. If you don't have a value in a checkbox, it's going to say whether it's on or off. So if in your code, you're expecting the name of a movie or the name of a size or the name of whatever, and all of a sudden all your code is putting out is on or off, that probably means that you didn't give it a value. Okay, so we said ID, we said name, we said type, we said value. We can give it, is there anything else hiding over there? No. We can give it an on click, which will connect it to a handler, which is the code that will be called when they click. And we could have given it a check property if we wanted to pre-select some of the movies. If we wanted to say, oh, everybody's seen Titanic, then I could say down in the Titanic one, I could say checked, and then it would come in design, it would be sort of pre-selected. Okay, so that is what a checkbox looked like, an awful lot like a radio button, except the type is checkbox instead of radio button. And then I have this weirdo name. But again, the weirdo name is more about PHP than about JavaScript. So there are all the movies. Here's my single checkbox for the conditions. It has all the same properties. It goes to a different function. Does it? No, maybe it doesn't. No, because all they do when they click something is to clear things out. So it does go to the same function. And I have a value of agree. I could, for this one, I probably could have worked with an on and an off. That would have worked, but I decided to make it say agree. And there we go. So that's just, this is going to be the one off checkbox. Here's my button, here's my div to show my result. And as I say, I have an open div and a closed div. And so when I'm putting something on the page, I'm going to work with the inner HTML. And if I wanted to put them one line at a time, I would use an HTML break. I think in a later example, I do that. Here we have the enabling of the button. I'm looping over the movies and making sure they're not checked when I start. Some browsers will remember what the user previously did. And I'm saying I don't want the browser to do that. So I am purposely unchecking all my checkboxes. Here's the code to handle the button. I'm asking here, this is my one-off checkbox. I work with the one-off checkbox based on its ID, because it's a one-off, so it has a unique ID, and so I grab it by its ID, and I'm asking if it's checked, which is true or false, and then I put my exclamation point in the beginning to invert that. So if basically I asked if it's not checked. You can say if the checked equals false, that works. But I'm working with here the inverting the not operator. So if they did not check it, then I'm saying you must agree to the conditions and return. So I'm leaving my function. Otherwise, I will continue. I'm going to get an array of movies. Now I'm dealing with the set of checkboxes. I'm going to get an array of movies. So what I get from the user is going to be an array. So I set up an empty array. I'm looping over my checkboxes by using the get elements. Again, here's a thing that people tend to get wrong. Get elements with an S by name. Get element. Up here, I had the one-off checkbox. It's get element by ID, and there's one of them. Down here, I'm working with the set of checkboxes. I'm grouping them by name, so it's get elements with an S by name, and then I give the name. That's an array, so it has a length. I set up a loop over that length. I'm asking if the checkbox is checked. If the ith checkbox is checked, I'm grabbing its value and adding it to my array. When I'm done my loop, I ask if my little array that I made is of length 0. It says you didn't choose any movies. Otherwise, it alerts the movies you chose. It puts them in the console. And then here I'm using my array and a little code to create what's called an ordered list in HTML. So I start off with an OL, and way at the end, I have a close OL. That makes an ordered list. That's what gave me the numbering. So this numbering is from an ordered list. And then around each item in an ordered list, there's an open LI list item and there's a close LI. And so between each item, there's this, so I have I have an array of things. Join puts this, whatever you put between the join, between each item, between each pair of items in my array, it will add this code. And join is like the opposite of split. And so I made this, that's how I made my ordered array, and I disabled the button. If they click on the checkbox, I'm clearing out my answer, I'm re-enabling the button, and I'm throwing something into my console log. Okay, so that was version 1 of checkbox. Questions? All right. So I'm going to go to version 2. I think I get rid of the one-off checkbox and just focus on, because that one's not really going to change. Okay. So here's version 2. Just to get a little bit more sophisticated, when I ask you to do it, you're allowed to work at any of the levels of sophistication that you choose. But as I always say, you better be, if you want to get the big coding job at the end of the day, if you want to go to Google or what have you, then you better be at least attempting to work at the more sophisticated level. I'm probably not sophisticated enough on my own to get you into Google, almost certainly not. But if you're not working at in my class, if you're not working at the most sophisticated level, then don't go for the Google job. Okay. Where am I at? Open this. It's version 2. There's a CSS, there's a JavaScript, and a checkbox. So here's the HTML. I took the JavaScript out. Here's the JavaScript. It's now in a separate file. The CSS is in a separate file, and I don't think it's changed. So here's the HTML. What's changed? Not much other than I took the JavaScript out, but I also took the on-click out. So I'm not putting the on-click attribute into the HTML. Otherwise, the HTML is as it was before, and I got rid of the condition one, I got rid of the single one. And here is my JavaScript moved to a separate file. So trying to get more sophisticated, separate my style from my design from my code. So my CSS, my HTML, my JavaScript, trying to separate them. That's being at least somewhat more sophisticated. So here's my JS. Enable the button, or sorry, set up a click event for the button. I'm going to add check events or click events for the checkboxes. Again, I was doing this previously with the on clicks, and now I'm trying to be more sophisticated, so I'm putting it in my JavaScript. I'm grabbing an array of checkboxes, working with get elements by name. And checkboxes, you can't use add event listener to a checkbox. Add event listener belongs to an element object, and checks is not an element object. Checks is an array. It's an array of element objects. So if I loop over the array, then I can add the handling event. So I loop over my array, and I take each item in the array and do add event listener. I'm adding a click listener, and then I must define this function for you below. disable the button. Here I am looping over the checkboxes. I could have said here checks, but I started it all over again for no good reason. I'm using a for each. The arguments of the for each are the element of the array and the counter of the array. I'm not using the index of the array, so I don't really need the I. I'm using what's called a fat arrow function, and I'm taking the check property of the element and making it false. I'm unchecking all my checkboxes. If they click the button, then I'm going to see which movies they selected. I have an array. I'm looping. I'm finding the checked boxes here. So what I did previously was looped through all of the checks, asked if they were checked, and looped. So I was looping over the big array. Now I'm taking a slightly different approach. I'm grabbing the checked. I'm using a query selector all, and I'm grabbing the check boxes. So this is a smaller loop. And then I'm looping over that smaller loop of checks. So above I have checks, which is all the check boxes. Down here I have checks, and that is the check boxes that happen to be currently selected. And I am pushing their values onto my user input array. This part's pretty much the same. If they didn't choose a movie, if the length is 0, they didn't choose a movie, I yell. Well, I don't yell, but I just say you don't like movies. And otherwise, I'm showing them an alert. I'm showing them in the console. Here, previously, I made an ordered list. And here instead, I'm joining them with a break. And so I'm just putting one under the other without the numbers. So with an ordered list, they were automatically numbered and they were indented. But you can also style in ordered lists to have it be letters instead of numbers. But and that's what I did previously. But here I am just putting in a standard old break. Just put each one on its own line and end of story. Disable the button. Here's my clearing event. Any checkbox you click, clear out the answer, enable a button, throw something in the console. Okay. And no, everybody's muted, so I don't know, picking up some sound somewhere. All right, so that was version 2. Version 3. And I'm going to add the checkboxes dynamically, just like last time I added the radio buttons dynamically. There, version 3. So the style, pretty much the same. The checkbox, the HTML, there's almost nothing here now. Instead of all the checkboxes, I just have a div that will hold my checkboxes. And then I connect to my JavaScript. So there's almost nothing to my HTML now, because before all the code here was all the checkboxes and all the attributes I want checkboxes, but now I'm adding them dynamically. Now here's my my checklist. Okay, so here's an array of the movie titles. This makes this one the most reusable, because all I have to do is change the title of the movies and I have, a whole new thing. So I could go from overall movies to horror movies to romantic comedies, whatever, just by changing this array. Okay, here's me getting the div. Here's me looping through my movies, and I have to make my checkboxes. I'm creating an element of the input type. I'm setting its type attribute to checkbox, its value to the index I, its name property to check movie, that makes them a group. Its ID, the ID just has to be something unique. So I said check plus the EL, the name of the movie. I'm giving it an on-click property, and I'm appending it to my target div. I want the associated label. I create a label. I make its for property the same as I made the ID property above. I am creating a text node with the name. I'm appending that child, and then I'm appending the label. And then I'm adding a break and putting it in the target. So that added dynamically all my checkboxes, my labels, and put them each on its own line. I'm adding a click event. I'm disabling the button. I'm looping over the checkboxes and making their check property false. Here's the button. I have my empty array of movies. I'm grabbing all the checked movies. I'm looping over the checked movies and adding the values to my array. If they didn't choose any, I'm saying we didn't choose any movies. Otherwise, I'm displaying as before. If they check a movie, I clear it out, enable the button, and I am showing something in the log. So just 3 versions, sort of growing sophistication. The checkboxes look an awful lot like the radio buttons, especially in terms of design, and that they have almost all the same attributes. And then the one thing that is different is what kind of answer you get. Before, with the radio buttons, you got a single answer, because that radio buttons had that built-in property. You could only choose one. And checkboxes are giving you an array. All right. One more thing I want to show you for the recording, then I'll just hang out and answer questions. So I wanted to show just something about a grid. So just a grid is sort of just an HTML and CSS thing, nothing to do with JavaScript. But it's a nice way to sort of control your page design. And where am I at? Grid demo, here it is. And it doesn't do anything. This is an image. A painting by somebody, Piet Mondrian, who just painted these rectangles and made them different colors. And then I just tried to make a grid that sort of looked like that as just a test to see if I could control things grid-wise. And I made this. Okay. So let's jump down to the HTML. Here's my HTML. I have a div. First, I have an image. That's the actual image of Piet Mondrian. And then next to it, I have my div. I have the overall thing that makes everything else a grid. And then I have my individual pieces. So they're all given a class of grid item. So they'll have some common styling based on the class. And then they'll have some individual styling based on the ID. So let me go back up. And then I put in these numbers just so we can see what was what. And of course, that's not really there in the painting that I'm duplicating. But anyway, okay. So I styling my grid container, and I made it display inline grid. So that's inline grid, let them sit next to each other. A div wants to be on a line by itself. So if I style it, even if it's a div and I style it as a grid, it will want to be by itself. But inline grid will want to share space with other things. I gave it a width. I'm working with a something that was 9 columns and 8 rows. So that's what this thing says here. Here's my 9 columns and my 8 rows. And then I have a gap, a space between things of 10. So this 485 up here, the whole width of my grid was, I had 9 columns of 45 apiece, and then between them I had 8 gaps of 10 apiece. So that was my calculation for this 485. I gave the whole thing a border. The border is sort of extends outside of the rectangle, and I align things on the top. So if I didn't do that, my picture and the picture, the image element and my grid have the same top. That's what align top did for me. Vertical align top. Everybody has this, all the divs within the grid have this styling grid item. There was a class, and when you're in CSS, when you're styling a class, you start off with a dot. So this says everything in that class has this style. The first thing was also a class, but it could have been an ID because there was only one container in my example. But there were a bunch of grid items inside, I think 7, and they all share this style. Not much to it, but they all share this style. Then I start styling the individual rectangles based on their ID. So the first div has an ID of a rect_1. And when you're styling based on an individual thing based on its ID, you start with the pound, number, hashtag, whatever you want to call it. So, so there's the, I usually say pound or number, rect1. So this is a styling of the element with an ID of rect1. We're saying it starts in row 1 and column 1. And then in terms of rows, it goes down 4 rows. And in terms of columns, it goes over 3 columns. So that is this 1 here. It's going down 4 rows and 3 columns. That's what this says. And we said its color was white. So that's this that's this 1 here. The next one is this great big red 2. It's in row 1 and column 3. And it's going over. So if I say 1 to 4, sorry, that goes from 1 up to and not including 4. So that spans 3 rows and 2 columns. And then down here, if I say span, that's an exact counting. So this means it includes 6 rows and 7 columns. And it was red. So that was the big red one. And then they're all more or less, they go from there. This one is in row 4 and column 1. It goes from 4 to 7. So 4, 5, and 6. Doesn't include 7. And the columns, it goes 1, 2, does not include 3. That was 3 was the white one. That's here. And we just carry on. So it's row and column, and you can say how they span. in the styling. So I just wanted to show you. I don't have you, like on a test, I don't often have you do a grid styling because they can be tedious, but I'll often give you one. So you should be able to, if I give you a grid styling, you should be able to sort of navigate it and understand like where you are in it. But I probably won't have you make one from scratch. I also sometimes use tables, and they can achieve a similar effect. I guess a grid is more flexible. I can sort of restyle it, whereas a grid is a little bit more, a table is a little bit more fixed. A grid I can get to, like if the page were a very narrow page, I could get it to sort of restyle on the fly. So that's what I wanted to show you in terms of the styling. And any questions for the recording? No questions for the recording. Stop the recording.